The champagne flute trembled in Vivian Caldwell's hand as her ex-husband's voice carried across the pristine white tent, his words slicing through her daughter's wedding reception like shards of broken glass. "Poor Vivian," Marcus announced to his table of business associates, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Still playing dress-up in her little secretary outfits, pretending she matters. Thank God Sophia inherited my ambition instead of her mother's limitations. The laughter that followed felt like acid in Vivian's chest, but she held her composure, unaware that in exactly 37 minutes, the best man would rise to give a toast that would leave Marcus speechless and transform her from the forgotten ex-wife into someone whose very presence commanded respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vivian had chosen her seat carefully that morning, positioning herself at a table near the back of the reception tent where she could watch her daughter Sophia glide across the dance floor without drawing attention to herself. At 48, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill honed through years of Marcus's subtle undermining and public diminishments. Her navy blue dress was modest and professional, the kind she wore to her job at the county clerk's office, chosen specifically because she knew Marcus would expect nothing more from her. The past 15 years since their divorce had been a careful dance of avoidance and civility, orchestrated entirely around their daughter's well-being. Vivian had swallowed countless insults, endured endless condescension, and watched Marcus build his real estate empire while painting her as the small-town woman who couldn't keep up with his aspirations. What Marcus didn't know was that Vivian's quiet life in Cedar Falls, Missouri, was not a surrender, but a deliberate choice, a carefully constructed peace after storms he couldn't even imagine. She watched Sophia laugh with her new husband David, a kind-hearted veterinarian who reminded Vivian of the man she had once believed Marcus could become. The young couple's joy was infectious, and for a moment, Vivian allowed herself to feel pure happiness for her daughter's future. Sophia looked radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, the same dress Vivian had worn 25 years ago when she had believed in forever with the man who now sat 3 tables away, regaling his audience with stories of his latest property acquisitions. Marcus had arrived with Celeste, his third wife, a blonde pharmaceutical sales representative, 20 years his junior, who laughed at his jokes with practiced enthusiasm. Vivian felt no jealousy, only a distant pity for the woman who didn't yet understand that Marcus's charm was a performance with a limited run. She had learned that lesson the hard way during the slow dissolution of their marriage, watching him systematically dismantle her confidence while building his own empire on the foundation of her sacrifices. The reception had been progressing smoothly until Marcus's voice began to rise with each glass of wine. Vivian recognized the pattern from their marriage, the way alcohol loosened his tongue and sharpened his cruelty. She had hoped that today, of all days, he would maintain his composure for Sophia's sake. But as the evening wore on, she watched him gesture expansively while speaking to his table companions, his eyes occasionally flicking in her direction with unmistakable malice. "You have to understand," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying clearly across the nearby tables. "Vivian never had any real ambitions. She was content to play house while I built something meaningful. Some people are just comfortable with mediocrity." The businessman beside him nodded knowingly, casting a dismissive glance toward Vivian's table. "It's fortunate Sophia inherited my drive instead of settling for her mother's limited perspective on life." Vivian's fingers tightened around her napkin, but her expression remained serene. She had learned long ago that reacting to Marcus's provocations only fueled his appetite for humiliation. Instead, she focused on her daughter's happiness, reminding herself that this day was about Sophia, not about old wounds that should have healed years ago. Yet each word felt like a physical blow, resurrecting memories of countless similar moments during their marriage when Marcus had made her feel invisible and worthless. The irony was not lost on her that Marcus had no idea who she really was, had never bothered to ask about the years before they met or the life she had built after he left. To him, she existed only in relation to him, first as his wife and now as his ex, a supporting character in his narrative of success and sophistication. He saw her as a small-town clerk because that was the role that made him feel superior, never questioning why someone would choose such a quiet existence or what might have come before. Across the tent, Sophia was greeting guests with David, her face glowing with contentment. She caught her mother's eye and waved, blowing a kiss that made Vivian's heart swell with pride. Sophia had grown into an extraordinary woman despite the complicated dynamics of her parents' relationship, choosing kindness over cynicism and building a life based on genuine connection rather than material achievement. She was everything Vivian had hoped she would become, strong and independent, but never cruel, successful, but never at others' expense. The wedding party began gathering near the head table, and Vivian noticed David's best man, Colonel James Richardson, checking his watch. He was an imposing figure, even in civilian clothes, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Vivian had met him briefly during the rehearsal dinner, where his polite but distant demeanor had suggested he was simply fulfilling his duties as David's childhood friend. She had no reason to expect that their paths would intersect again beyond the customary pleasantries. As the evening light began to fade through the tent's translucent walls, Vivian felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling around her like a familiar coat. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to being defined by what others believed she was, rather than who she actually was. Tomorrow, she would return to her quiet life in Cedar Falls, to her position at the county office where she helped residents navigate bureaucracy with patience and competence. Marcus would return to his world of deals and acquisitions, probably never thinking of her again until the next family gathering, requiring their careful choreography of civility. But tonight, as the best man rose to his feet and called for the guests' attention, Vivian had no idea that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to shatter completely, revealing a truth that would redefine not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself in the aftermath of years spent hiding in plain sight. 23 years earlier, Second Lieutenant Vivian Hayes had stood in the scorching heat of Fort Benning, Georgia, sweat streaming down her face as her drill instructor screamed instructions that would either break her spirit or forge it into something unbreakable. She had chosen the latter, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. The girl from Cedar Falls who had grown up helping her grandmother tend the church garden had discovered she possessed a steel core that could withstand anything the military threw at her. What had started as a desperate escape from a dead-end hometown had evolved into a calling that would define her for the next decade. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Vivian remembered the first time she had to crawl under barbed wire while live ammunition flew overhead, the way her hands shook so violently she could barely grip her rifle. But fear, she learned, was just another obstacle to overcome, like the rope climbs that left her palms bleeding, or the 20-mile marches that pushed her body beyond what she thought possible. Each challenge conquered added another layer to the armor she was building around her heart, protection that would serve her well in battles she couldn't yet imagine. Military intelligence had recruited her straight out of basic training, recognizing something in her that she was still discovering herself. The quiet girl who had once been overlooked in high school classrooms suddenly found herself entrusted with classified information that could shift the balance of international conflicts. Her first assignment had taken her to Germany during the final years of the Cold War, where she spent months analyzing intercepted communications and preparing briefings for generals whose names appeared in history books. The work was methodical and demanding, requiring a level of focus and discretion that suited her natural temperament perfectly. While other officers sought glory in combat roles, Vivian found satisfaction in the shadows, knowing that her analysis and recommendations were saving lives, even if no one would ever know her name. She developed a reputation for thoroughness and insight that earned her rapid promotions and increasingly sensitive assignments. By the time she made captain, she was briefing NATO commanders and coordinating intelligence operations across 3 continents. Her specialty became counterintelligence operations in hostile territories, work that required her to become someone else entirely. She learned to speak flawless Arabic and Russian, to blend into crowds in Damascus and Moscow, to gather information while maintaining covers so deep that even her own family believed she was stationed safely behind a desk in Virginia. The loneliness was crushing at times, but the importance of the work sustained her through months of isolation and constant danger. The mission that would define her career came during her 7th year of service, when she was deployed to Eastern Europe as tensions escalated in the region. Operating under diplomatic cover, she spent 18 months infiltrating arms-dealing networks that were supplying weapons to terrorist organizations.
The intelligence she gathered led to the disruption of 3 major trafficking operations and prevented an attack on a civilian airport that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. For her efforts, she received the Defense Superior Service Medal in a ceremony so classified that only 5 people attended, including the Secretary of Defense himself. But the cost of living in constant deception was taking its toll. Vivian found herself unable to form meaningful relationships, always calculating what she could safely reveal about herself, always maintaining the careful distance that operational security demanded. She watched her fellow officers marry and start families, while she remained married only to her mission, isolated by the very skills that made her invaluable to her country. The woman who could convince enemy agents to betray their own countries found herself unable to connect with anyone in her personal life. The breaking point came during her final assignment, a deep cover operation that required her to spend 2 years posing as a graduate student in international relations while gathering intelligence on foreign operatives attempting.
Marcus had entered her life during this vulnerable period of transition, when she was still learning how to be an ordinary person with ordinary concerns. He was everything she thought she wanted: stable and uncomplicated, a successful businessman whose biggest secrets involved tax write-offs and client entertainment expenses. Their courtship was refreshingly normal, dinner dates and weekend trips that required no operational planning beyond choosing which restaurant or hotel. For the first time since she was 18 years old, Vivian could envision a future that didn't involve classified briefings and false identities. Marriage to Marcus had represented the final phase of her transformation, from colonel to civilian, from operative to wife. She had thrown herself into the role with the same dedication she had once applied to infiltrating enemy organizations, learning to cook his favorite meals and decorate their home according to his tastes. When Sophia was born, Vivian poured all her protective instincts into motherhood, finding in her daughter a mission more important than any she had ever accepted from her government. The irony was that Marcus had fallen in love with the very qualities that made her an exceptional intelligence officer: her ability to read people and situations, her calm under pressure, her talent for becoming whatever others needed her to be. But he never understood the source of those qualities, never questioned why his wife seemed to know exactly what to say in every social situation, or why she remained unflappable during crises that sent other people into panic. To him, she was simply a naturally intuitive woman, not someone who had been trained by the world's best intelligence agencies to understand human psychology and manipulate social dynamics. As their marriage deteriorated, Vivian had made a conscious decision to embrace the invisibility that Marcus seemed to prefer. If he wanted a small-town wife with limited ambitions, she would give him that version of herself, burying the woman who had once briefed world leaders so deep that sometimes even she forgot she had ever existed. The job at the county clerk's office was not a defeat, but a deliberate choice, a place where she could use her skills to help ordinary people navigate bureaucracy while maintaining the quiet anonymity she had come to treasure. But now, sitting in this wedding tent while her ex-husband dissected her supposed limitations for the entertainment of his business associates, Vivian felt something stirring in the depths of her carefully constructed ordinary life. It was the same sensation she had felt before every dangerous mission, a quiet alertness that preceded action. She had spent 15 years in hiding, but the warrior who had earned medals in ceremonies too secret to be recorded was still there, waiting beneath the surface of the helpful county clerk who processed marriage licenses and property transfers with infinite patience. Colonel James Richardson was rising to his feet at the head table, testing the microphone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to addressing large groups. Something in his bearing triggered recognition in the part of Vivian's mind that never stopped analyzing and cataloging, the part that had kept her alive through a decade of operations in hostile territory. As he began to speak, she realized with a mixture of dread and anticipation that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to collide with a past she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Colonel James Richardson's voice carried across the reception tent with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in 3 different war zones. His words began conventionally enough, praising David and Sophia's love story and expressing gratitude to the families for welcoming him into their celebration. But as he continued speaking, something shifted in his tone, a subtle change that made Vivian's pulse quicken with recognition. She had heard that same inflection countless times during classified briefings, the careful modulation that preceded the delivery of crucial intelligence.
David has always been blessed with exceptional judgment, Richardson continued, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. He chooses his friends wisely, his career thoughtfully, and most importantly, he chose a bride whose character reflects the very best of her upbringing. His days lingered momentarily on Vivian's table before moving on, but something in that brief connection sent electricity down her spine. Sophia Caldwell embodies the values of integrity, courage, and selfless service that I've encountered in only the finest individuals throughout my military career. Marcus's laughter cut through the respectful silence, loud and dismissive. Selfless service, he repeated mockingly to his table mates. I suppose working at the county clerk's office counts as public service these days. His words drew uncomfortable chuckles from his business associates, but Richardson's expression remained unchanged, professional and controlled. Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar surge of adrenaline that she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Richardson adjusted his posture slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone with Vivian's training would recognize it as the shift from casual conversation to mission execution. Speaking of public service, he said, his voice taking on a steel edge that silenced even Marcus's table, I had the extraordinary honor recently of reviewing classified military records for a Pentagon historical preservation project. It's fascinating how many true heroes walk among us unrecognized, their sacrifices hidden by the very nature of their service to our country. The tent fell completely silent now, the kind of anticipatory quiet that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. Vivian's hands were steady on the table, but her mind was racing through possibilities, calculating odds and outcomes with the efficiency of someone trained to think 10 steps ahead. She could see Sophia watching from the head table, curiosity replacing confusion as she sensed the shift in atmosphere. David's mother-in-law, for instance, Richardson continued, his words dropping like stones into still water, is someone I've actually encountered before in my research, though I suspect very few people here tonight are aware of her remarkable background. He paused, allowing the weight of anticipation to settle over the crowd before delivering the revelation that would shatter Marcus's smug confidence completely. Mrs. Vivian Caldwell served our country with extraordinary distinction for over a decade as Colonel Vivian Hayes Williams, one of the most decorated intelligence officers of her generation. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Marcus's wineglass hitting the table with enough force to crack the stem. His face had gone completely white, cycling through disbelief, shock, and something approaching horror as the implications of Richardson's words settled in. Around him, his business associates sat frozen, suddenly understanding that their evening's entertainment had been built on a foundation of complete ignorance. Richardson wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet case, holding it up for the crowd to see. Colonel Williams received the Defense Superior Service Medal for operations so classified that I can't discuss them, even now 23 years later. Her work in counterintelligence saved countless American lives and prevented multiple terrorist attacks on civilian targets. His voice carried clearly to every corner of the tent, ensuring that Marcus's humiliation would be witnessed by everyone present. She walked away from a guaranteed promotion to general, from a corner office in the Pentagon, from a retirement package worth millions of dollars, because she valued family over personal glory. Richardson's eyes found Vivian's across the crowded tent, and in that moment she saw recognition, respect, and something approaching reverence. She chose love over legacy, and in doing so, she demonstrated the kind of character that makes our country worth defending. Vivian rose slowly from her chair, her movements fluid and controlled despite the emotional earthquake reshaping the landscape of her existence. Every eye in the tent was on her now, but for the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel the need to make herself smaller or invisible. The woman who had once infiltrated terrorist cells and briefed NATO commanders was emerging from the shadows she had wrapped around herself like protective armor. Marcus was staring at her as if seeing a stranger, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had dismissed and diminished with the decorated war hero being honored before his eyes. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face, years of assumptions crumbling, as he realized that his ex-wife had been playing a role just as thoroughly as she had during her intelligence operations. But this time, the role had been that of an ordinary woman content with an ordinary life. "Vivian," he whispered, but his voice carried in the silence. "You never told me. All those years, you never said anything about... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have required him to acknowledge how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had once promised to love and honor. Vivian walked toward the head table with measured steps, her bearing unconsciously shifting into the command presence that had once intimidated foreign operatives and earned the respect of superior officers. Sophia was crying now, but her tears were of pride and wonder rather than sorrow. Her daughter had always known there was something special about her mother, some deep well of strength and wisdom that seemed disproportionate to her quiet life in Cedar Falls. Richardson handed Vivian the small velvet case, and she opened it to reveal the medal she had earned but never been able to display, its ribbons still crisp despite the years. "This belongs to you, Colonel," he said quietly. "It always has." The transformation was complete now, visible to everyone in the tent. The meek ex-wife who had absorbed Marcus's condescension for 15 years was gone, replaced by the woman who had once walked into enemy territory armed with nothing but her intelligence and courage. Vivian pinned the medal to her dress, not as a trophy, but as a declaration of identity reclaimed. "Thank you, Colonel Richardson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent tent. "For the record, and for the preservation of accuracy that I know you value, it's not Mrs. Caldwell. It hasn't been for 15 years. My name is Colonel Vivian Hayes Williams, United States Army Intelligence, retired." She looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, watching him flinch under the weight of her gaze. "Some of us understand that true strength doesn't require an audience, and real service doesn't need applause." The applause came anyway, starting with David and Sophia and spreading through the tent like wildfire until everyone except Marcus and his associates was on their feet. Vivian accepted the recognition not for herself, but for every woman who had...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
You weren't just giving me advice, were you? You were teaching me what you had learned out there, in places I can't even imagine. Vivian squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the weight of years of carefully maintained secrets finally lifting from her shoulders. "I wanted you to have the confidence I had to fight for," she said softly. "But I also wanted you to choose your own battles, not inherit mine. Everything I did, everything I sacrificed, was so you could have the luxury of being yourself without having to prove your worth to anyone." She paused, watching Marcus across the tent as he sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to process the evening's revelations. "I never wanted my past to define your future." David joined them, still wearing his dress uniform from the ceremony, his face reflecting a mixture of awe and protective concern for his new wife. He had known Vivian only as Sophia's devoted mother, a kind woman who worked at the county office and never missed any of her daughter's important moments. The transformation he had witnessed was so complete that he found himself questioning every interaction they had ever had, wondering what other depths lay hidden beneath her carefully constructed ordinary facade. "Mrs. Williams," he began, then caught himself. "Colonel Williams, I want you to know that learning about your service makes me even more honored to be joining this family. Sophia's strength and integrity make so much more sense now." He glanced toward his best man, who was deep in conversation with several wedding guests eager to hear more about his connection to Vivian's military career. "James told me he recognized something about you during the rehearsal dinner, but he wanted to confirm his suspicions before saying anything. He spent all week making calls to old contacts at the Pentagon." Across the tent, Marcus was finally showing signs of life, though his movements seemed mechanical and uncertain. He rose from his chair with visible effort, his business associates watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed schadenfreude. The man who had built his reputation on reading people and closing deals had been publicly revealed as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood the most important person in his life for over 2 decades. His approach toward Vivian's table was halting, interrupted by several false starts as he appeared to lose his nerve. When he finally reached them, Marcus looked like a man who had aged a decade in the span of an hour. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by a vulnerability that Vivian had only seen once before, during the final conversation that had ended their marriage. But this time, the vulnerability wasn't manipulative or self-serving. It was the raw exposure of someone confronting the magnitude of their own ignorance.
Vivian, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't understand. All those years we were married, you let me believe you were just a teacher, just someone who wanted a simple life. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me with the truth? His questions carried the weight of genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't comprehend why someone would choose to hide such extraordinary achievements. Vivian studied his face for a long moment, seeing not the successful businessman who had diminished her for years, but the insecure young man she had once loved, someone who had needed to feel superior to others in order to feel worthy himself. Because, Marcus, she said with infinite patience, you fell in love with the idea of being the successful one in our relationship. You needed to be the provider, the achiever, the one with the impressive career. If you had known the truth, it would have changed everything between us, and not necessarily for the better. Her words hit him with visible force, causing him to step back as if physically struck. The truth of her assessment was written across his face as he processed the implications of what she was saying. All those years of subtle condescension, all the times he had made her feel small and insignificant, had been built on a foundation of complete misconception. He had been married to one of the most accomplished women of her generation and had convinced himself that he was doing her a favor by staying with her. But the divorce, he stammered, all those fights about my ambition, about you not supporting my career. You said I was putting business before family, but you never told me you had given up a career like that for us. Why did you let me think you didn't understand sacrifice? His confusion was genuine, but it revealed how completely he had missed the point of their conflicts. Even now, faced with the truth of her service, he was making it about himself and his wounded pride. Sophia stood up, her protective instincts finally overriding her desire to understand the family dynamics she had grown up navigating. Dad, she said firmly, this isn't the time or place for this conversation. This is my wedding day, and I won't have it turned into a therapy session for your ego. Her voice carried echoes of her mother's authority, the unmistakable tone of someone who would not be dismissed or ignored. Mom chose to build a life that prioritized my happiness and stability. Maybe you should spend some time thinking about what that says about her character versus what your reaction tonight says about yours. The rebuke from his daughter seemed to snap Marcus out of his self-absorbed spiral, reminding him that his behavior was being witnessed by everyone who mattered to him. He looked around the tent, taking in the faces of friends and business associates who had heard every word of the evening's revelations, and seemed to realize that his reputation as a discerning judge of character had been permanently damaged. The man who prided himself on reading people and making smart investments had been publicly revealed as someone who had spectacularly failed to recognize the value of what he had possessed. Colonel Richardson approached their group, his timing perfect as always, carrying with him the easy authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Mr. Caldwell, he said politely, I believe your daughter has made an excellent point about appropriate timing. Perhaps we should allow the happy couple to enjoy the rest of their celebration. His tone was diplomatic, but carried an unmistakable suggestion that Marcus's presence was no longer welcome in their conversation. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to shrink further under the combined weight of their disapproval. He looked at Vivian one last time, his expression cycling through regret, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding. I'm sorry, he said quietly, though whether he was apologizing for his behavior that evening or for years of accumulated slights was unclear. I never knew who you really were. Vivian's response was gentle but final. No, Marcus, you never wanted to know who I really was. There's a difference. She watched him walk away, not with satisfaction, but with the sad recognition that some people spend their entire lives looking for validation in all the wrong places, never recognizing the treasures that are right in front of them. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Vivian found herself surrounded by people eager to express their respect and admiration for her service. But the conversation she treasured most was with an elderly veteran who had served in Vietnam, a man who understood the particular weight of carrying secrets and the relief of finally being seen for who you truly are. They spoke quietly about the cost of service and the complicated journey back to civilian life, two warriors who had found their way home by different paths but understood the terrain of sacrifice intimately. The last dance of the evening belonged to David and Sophia, but as Vivian watched her daughter move with grace and confidence in her husband's arms, she knew that her greatest achievement wasn't recorded in any classified file or commemorated by any medal. It was the woman her daughter had become, strong enough to demand respect but kind enough to offer forgiveness, brave enough to choose love but wise enough to choose it carefully. Colonel Vivian Hayes Williams drove home to Cedar Falls that night with her medal pinned to her dress and her secrets finally released into the world, feeling lighter than she had in 15 years. The quiet life she had built wasn't a retreat from significance, but a different kind of victory, one measured not in battles won, but in love given and received, in a daughter raised to know her own worth, and in the peace that comes from choosing authenticity over applause. 3 months after Sophia's wedding, Vivian stood in the conference room of the county building, facing a group of local veterans who had requested a meeting with their newly revealed war hero. Word of her military service had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, transforming her from the helpful clerk behind the desk into something approaching a local legend. The story had been picked up by the regional newspaper, then a veterans magazine, and finally by a military history podcast that reached thousands of listeners nationwide. Suddenly, the quiet life she had carefully constructed was anything but quiet. The Veterans Committee had come with a proposal that both honored her service and challenged her determination to remain invisible. They wanted to nominate her for the Missouri Veterans Hall of Fame, an honor that would require her to attend ceremonies, give speeches, and become the kind of public figure she had spent 15 years avoiding. The irony wasn't lost on her that after a decade of classified operations, where anonymity was literally a matter of life and death, she was being asked to step into the spotlight by the very people she had once served to protect. "Colonel Williams," said Frank Morrison, an elderly Marine who had lost his leg in Korea, "you've spent enough time hiding your light under a bushel. This community needs to know what real service looks like, especially the young people who think heroism is something they see in movies." His weathered hands gripped his cane as he leaned forward earnestly. "You don't owe us anything, but we're asking you to consider what your story could mean to others who are struggling to find their purpose or their courage." Vivian listened to their arguments with the same analytical attention she had once applied to intelligence briefings, weighing the potential benefits against the personal costs. The woman who emerged at Sophia's wedding was still adjusting to life without the protective camouflage of ordinariness. Every trip to the grocery store now involved conversations with neighbors who wanted to thank her for her service or ask questions about her military career. The barista at the local coffee shop had started refusing to let her pay for her drinks, and the mechanic who serviced her car had quietly fixed several problems without charging her. The attention was well-meaning but overwhelming for someone who had trained herself to blend into crowds and avoid notice. Yet, as she looked around the table at these aging warriors, men and women who had carried their own invisible burdens for decades, she recognized.
Meanwhile, the revelation of her true identity had sent shockwaves through other areas of her life that she was still learning to navigate. Her supervisor at the county office had initially been starstruck, treating her with a deference that made their working relationship awkward and strained. Coworkers who had shared coffee and casual conversation for years suddenly seemed uncertain how to interact with someone whose background was so dramatically different from what they had imagined. The comfortable anonymity that had allowed her to form genuine friendships was complicated now by the knowledge that she was not who she had appeared to be. More challenging was the flood of contact from her former military colleagues who had tracked her down through various networks and databases. Email after email arrived from people she had served with, expressing everything from surprise and admiration to hurt and betrayal that she had disappeared so completely from their lives. Some wanted to reconnect, others sought closure on old operations, and a few carried messages from senior officers who had never understood why one of their most promising intelligence assets had simply vanished into civilian obscurity. The most difficult message had come from General Patricia Hawkins, who had been a colonel during Vivian's final years of service and was now commanding a major intelligence division at the Pentagon. Her email was formal but carried an undertone of personal disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism from strangers. She had written about missed opportunities and wasted potential, about the younger officers who could have benefited from Vivian's mentorship, and about important work that remained undone because experienced operators like her had chosen personal satisfaction over continued service. Reading those words had forced Vivian to confront questions she had avoided for 15 years. Had her decision to leave been an act of self-preservation or self-indulgence? Was she a warrior who had earned her rest, or a deserter who had abandoned her post when her country still needed her? The guilt was familiar, but more acute now that her choices were being examined by people who understood the weight of what she had walked away from. Sophia had become her anchor during this period of upheaval, calling every few days to check on her mother's emotional state and offering perspective that only someone who had grown up watching Vivian navigate complex situations could provide. Her daughter's marriage had settled into a comfortable rhythm, and David had proven to be not only a loving husband, but also a perceptive ally who understood that his mother-in-law was processing decades of suppressed identity in a matter of months. "You know what I think, Mom?" Sophia had said during one of their weekend conversations, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had inherited her mother's analytical mind along with her compassionate heart. "I think you're afraid that if you embrace being Colonel Williams again, you'll lose the parts of yourself that you discovered as just Vivian. But you're not the same person who left the military 15 years ago. You've learned things about peace and contentment and simple joy that you never could have learned in briefing rooms and foreign capitals." Her daughter's insight was characteristically accurate and uncomfortably penetrating. Vivian had indeed discovered aspects of herself during her civilian years that she valued deeply. The woman who could spend an entire afternoon helping an elderly citizen navigate Social Security paperwork without feeling that her talents were being wasted. The neighbor who brought soup to sick friends and attended every school concert and graduation in her community. The grandmother figure who had emerged naturally in her interactions with young people who needed guidance and encouragement. But Sophia wasn't finished with her analysis. "The thing is, those parts of yourself don't disappear just because you acknowledge your military service. If anything, they make your service more meaningful because they show what you were fighting to protect. You weren't just defending abstract principles or national interests, you were defending the right of people to live ordinary, peaceful lives, to worry about small things instead of life and death situations." The conversation had taken place on a crisp autumn morning as they walked through the park where Sophia had played as a child, past the playground equipment that Vivian had watched her daughter conquer with the same determination she had once brought to military obstacles. Watching her daughter's confidence and clarity about complex emotional issues, Vivian felt a pride that had nothing to do with medals or commendations and everything to do with the knowledge that she had raised someone capable of wisdom and compassion in equal measure. The situation with Marcus had evolved in unexpected directions as well. Rather than disappearing into embarrassed silence, he had surprised everyone by reaching out to Vivian with what appeared to be genuine attempts at understanding and reconciliation. His messages were awkward and clearly difficult for him to write, full of false starts and overthinking, but they revealed a man genuinely wrestling with the implications of how thoroughly he had misjudged his former wife. His latest email had been particularly revealing, describing a conversation with his current wife Celeste that had apparently opened his eyes to patterns in his behavior that extended far beyond his relationship with Vivian. Celeste had pointed out that he consistently diminished the accomplishments of women in his life, dismissing their achievements as luck or circumstance while attributing his own success to skill and hard work. The revelation had sent him into what he described as a crisis of self-examination that was both humbling and necessary. But perhaps more significantly, Marcus had begun making efforts to understand and support veterans' causes in ways that seemed motivated by genuine remorse rather than public relations concerns. He had quietly donated a substantial sum to a local organization that helped veterans transition to civilian careers, and had reached out to other business leaders to create a network of employment opportunities for former military personnel. The initiatives were handled with unusual discretion for someone who typically sought recognition for his charitable activities. Vivian wasn't ready to forgive him completely, and she wasn't sure she ever would be, but she could acknowledge that his efforts represented growth in a man who had seemed incapable of change. More importantly, his evolving understanding of her sacrifice was creating a foundation for a healthier relationship between him and Sophia, something that mattered more to Vivian than any personal reconciliation.
The decision about the Veterans Hall of Fame nomination crystallized during an unexpected encounter at the local hardware store, where Vivian had gone to buy supplies for a home repair project. She was examining paint samples when she overheard a conversation between two young women discussing their upcoming military deployments. One was expressing anxiety about leaving her family for a year-long assignment overseas, while the other was struggling with the decision of whether to re-enlist when her current commitment ended. Without fully intending to, Vivian found herself drawn into their conversation, offering practical advice about maintaining family connections during deployment and insights about finding purpose in military service that went beyond personal advancement. As they talked, she watched their expressions change from polite attention to genuine engagement, recognizing in their faces the same hunger for guidance and reassurance that she had felt as a young officer navigating the complexities of military life. The encounter lasted less than 20 minutes, but it reminded Vivian of something she had forgotten during her years of self-imposed isolation. Her experience and knowledge weren't just personal assets to be protected and preserved. They were resources that could benefit others who were facing the same challenges and choices that had once seemed insurmountable to her. The expertise she had spent 15 years hiding could serve a purpose beyond her own peace of mind. That evening, she called Frank Morrison and accepted the Veterans Committee nomination, but with conditions that reflected her hard-won understanding of how to balance public service with personal well-being. She would participate in ceremonies and speak at events, but only those that served clear educational or charitable purposes. She would share her story, but not the classified details that remained protected by security oaths she still honored. She would mentor young service members and veterans, but within boundaries that protect her privacy and family time. The nomination process required her to complete detailed paperwork that forced her to confront the full scope of her military achievements for the first time in years. Reading through citations and commendations that had been filed away and forgotten, she was struck by how much of her identity had been tied to external validation during her military years. The medals and promotions had provided a clear framework for measuring success and worth, something that civilian life, with its subtler achievements and quieter satisfactions, had never quite replaced. But she was also reminded of the moments that had meant the most to her during her service, instances when her work had directly prevented harm to innocent people, or when her guidance had helped a younger officer navigate a difficult situation. Those memories carried a weight and meaning that went beyond official recognition, representing the core values that had motivated her to serve in the first place and that continue to guide her choices in civilian life. The ceremony itself took place on a crisp November morning in the state capitol, with Sophia and David in attendance, along with Frank Morrison and several other veterans from Cedar Falls. As Vivian stood on the stage accepting the honor, she felt neither the pride she had expected nor the discomfort she had feared. Instead, she experienced a quiet sense of completeness, as if two halves of her identity were finally being acknowledged as parts of a coherent whole. Her acceptance speech was brief and focused on the veterans in the audience rather than her own achievements, emphasizing the ongoing challenges faced by service members transitioning to civilian life and the importance of community support for military families. She spoke about the different forms that service could take, from combat operations to community volunteering, and about the need to recognize and value contributions that might not fit traditional definitions of heroism. In the months that followed, Vivian's life settled into a new rhythm that incorporated both her military identity and her civilian values. She continued working at the county office, but also began volunteering with organizations that supported veterans and their families. She spoke occasionally at schools and community events, sharing lessons about leadership and resilience that applied equally to military and civilian contexts. Most importantly, she maintained the relationships and routines that had brought her joy during her years of anonymity, understanding that her worth wasn't dependent on public recognition or official titles. The transformation from invisible county clerk to acknowledged war hero had been jarring and sometimes painful, but it had also been liberating in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time in